The sleek glass doors of the dealership slid open as Monique Carter stepped inside. She was a striking figure, poised, confident, with a presence that seemed to demand respect. Her tailored dress hugged her frame just enough to reveal her hard-earned success, but not in a way that would be considered luxurious. As she stepped in, she could feel the judgmental eyes of the dealership's staff on her. She hadn't been here long, just a few minutes, but already she could sense the air thick with unspoken assumptions. The showroom gleamed with exclusive luxury vehicles, shiny, expensive, and designed to impress. But what surprised her was the complete lack of attention to her as she walked past the rows of cars. A sales representative, Richard, in his sharp, tailored suit, was the first to approach her. His fake smile barely hid the condescending look in his eyes as he scanned her from head to toe. Monique had dealt with this kind of treatment her whole life. He extended his hand, the smile still plastered on his face. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Welcome to Royal Motors," he said, his tone too sweet to be sincere. "I'm Richard. How can I help you today?" Monique shook his hand firmly. "I'm here to look for a car." Richard raised an eyebrow, the smile faltering slightly. He quickly glanced at her clothing and then back at her face. Of course. Well, let me direct you to our pre-owned section," he said with a barely noticeable chuckle, gesturing towards the far side of the showroom. "That's probably more in your price range." Monique held his gaze for a moment, unfazed by the remark. She wasn't going to take the bait. "I'm actually here for something more high-end. A gift," she replied, her voice steady but deliberate. Richard's eyes flickered with amusement, as if she had just told him she was going to buy a yacht with Monopoly money. He laughed softly. "Well, I'd be happy to show you some options in the pre-owned section. You know, that's where the best deals are. And—" "No, thank you," Monique interjected, not missing a beat. "I'm looking for something special for my son. He's graduating soon. I'd like something brand new." Richard paused for a moment, his expression shifting from amusement to something colder, more calculating. He crossed his arms, looking her over again. It was clear he didn't believe her. "Oh, of course. A graduation gift, huh?" His voice dropped to a tone that was just a little too condescending for Monique's taste. "Well, let's see. We've got the latest in luxury, though I'm not sure you'll find anything suitable for your needs," he said, as if she didn't belong in the same sentence as luxury. Monique was quiet for a moment. She could feel the weight of Richard's words, but she wasn't about to let him see how much they stung. Instead, she smiled back at him, her eyes sharp. "I'm sure you're familiar with high-end brands, but you're clearly not seeing the full picture here." Richard, clearly not ready to back down, stepped forward a little, his hands moving in an exaggerated gesture as he tried to steer her in the direction he thought she belonged. "I've been in the business for over a decade, ma'am. I know exactly what works for clients like you." The phrase, "clients like you," lingered in the air like a bad smell. Monique clenched her jaw but kept her voice calm. "Do you?" she asked, her tone slightly mocking. "I'm not sure you do." Richard, momentarily thrown off balance, chuckled again, though it came across as forced. "I'll have you know that Royal Motors has a very select clientele, ma'am. People like you just don't usually make their way into this part of town." Monique could feel the frustration creeping up, but she was determined not to show it. She had faced far worse in her life than some underpaid salesman who thought he knew who she was, based on her appearance. She'd learned long ago how to navigate spaces where people assumed she didn't belong. But now, with this salesperson mocking her, it felt different. It felt personal. She took a deep breath. "You have no idea who you're talking to." Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly not understanding the weight of her words. "I'm sure I don't, but if you're really serious about purchasing a high-end vehicle, I'd be happy to show you our best options." Monique's lips curled into a tight smile. "I think I'll speak with someone else." Richard opened his mouth to protest, but she turned away before he could say another word, walking toward the back of the showroom. She could feel the eyes of the sales team on her, judging her every move, but none of them dared to say a word. As she walked, she pulled out her phone and sent a quick text. She was here to get what she came for, but she wasn't about to play the game on Richard's terms. The text read, "Come down to the dealership." Richard's laughter still echoed faintly in her ears. But Monique didn't flinch. She was about to flip the script. She made her way to the customer lounge, where she could sit in peace and wait for her son. But the message wasn't lost on Richard. He'd made a grave mistake, but he didn't yet realize how much of one. And when he did, it would be too late. The lounge was quiet, except for the soft hum of a coffee machine in the corner. Monique sat on one of the plush chairs, her eyes scanning the high-end magazine laid out in front of her. She wasn't really reading. Her mind was elsewhere. Monique couldn't believe the looks, the dismissive tone, and the disbelief that someone who looked like her could possibly be there to buy a luxury car. She'd seen it all before, in every corner of the world that had tried to make her feel small. Monique leaned back, closed her eyes, and let her thoughts drift. She remembered growing up in a small neighborhood on the outskirts of Atlanta. It was the kind of place where the cracks in the pavement were the least of your worries. Her mother worked long hours in a factory, barely scraping by to feed Monique and her younger brother, Marcus. Every day was a battle, not just for food, but for respect, for space in a world that seemed determined to shove them into the shadows. Monique had learned early that she had to be smarter, sharper, and more determined than anyone around her if she wanted to rise above the poverty that clung to her like a second skin. She watched her mother struggle and made a vow to herself. She would never, ever let her circumstances define her. But even with that determination, there were still hurdles to clear, ones that were much bigger than the kind of thing her mother could prepare her for. It was the people who looked at her and assumed she wasn't capable of much more than what her neighborhood suggested. It started when she was just a teenager. Her first job was at a fast food restaurant, where she was constantly passed over for promotions, despite her work ethic. She had to fight for every single advancement, but she did it. By the time she graduated high school, she'd saved up enough money to take a chance on something bigger: real estate. At first, it was a side hustle. She started as an assistant, learning the ropes of the business, running errands, showing homes, and doing everything to make a name for herself. It wasn't easy, not by a long shot. Monique had to prove herself over and over again. She was told she was too young, too unpolished, too much of a risk. But those words didn't discourage her. They only made her work harder. And then, when things got tough, she'd think of her mother's face, tired and worn from the long hours, but still somehow filled with pride. That was enough to keep going. As Monique moved up in the real estate world, she began to understand how much of her success had to do with the ability to remain calm in the face of adversity. The business world wasn't much different from that fast food restaurant. It just had more zeros attached to the deals. People would smile to your face, but behind your back, they were always calculating whether you were someone they could afford to ignore or someone they had to take seriously. Her first major break came when she managed to secure a contract for a commercial building that had been sitting vacant for years. The project was a gamble, but she took it on, knowing that this would be the moment people would start paying attention. It wasn't just about making money for Monique. It was about proving to the world that she belonged in the same room as the people who had doubted her for so long. The deal was a huge success, and soon, Monique's name was on the lips of every major real estate developer in the city. But she knew that getting to the top was only half the battle. Staying there was the real challenge. That meant not letting the world's assumptions about her race, her gender, her upbringing, sway her. She had made it, but the world didn't just accept her. No, they were more than happy to remind her that there was always a line, a divide, a place she could be pushed back to. She could be one of them, but only if she played by their rules. But Monique had no intention of playing by anyone else's rules. She had her own playbook. She thought about her son, Tyler, who had grown up in a different world. He hadn't known what it was like to go without. She had made sure of that. She had worked tirelessly to ensure that he could focus on his future without worrying about what was lacking in his present. Tyler was brilliant from the moment he picked up his first tablet. While most kids his age were getting into sports or hobbies, Tyler was designing apps, creating games, and figuring out how things worked in the digital world. He was a quiet kid, Not the type to show off his skills, but his talent was undeniable. Monique had made sure to provide him with every opportunity she hadn't had. She remembered the first time she saw him pitch his idea for a startup. He was only 16, sitting in front of a group of venture capitalists who didn't take him seriously. At first, they had questions, doubts, and concerns, all centered on his age, his inexperience, and his unpolished composure. But Tyler stood his ground. He spoke with the kind of confidence Monique had tried to instill in him from an early age. And just like she had done all those years ago, he made them see beyond the surface. His ideas were sound, his passion was contagious, and his drive was unrelenting. Tyler's company quickly became one of the hottest startups in Silicon Valley, and his name, soon to be the face of a new era of tech innovators, was splashed across magazines and news articles. That was the world she had built for her son, a world where judgment was a thing of the past, a world where he wouldn't just meet expectations, he would exceed them. As Monique sat in the dealership lounge, her phone buzzed. She looked down, her lips curving into a small smile as she read the message from Tyler. "I'm on my way." She took a deep breath, knowing that this moment wasn't just about buying a car. It was about showing the world that they couldn't write her off. It was about standing up to people like Richard and reminding them that success didn't look like what they thought it did. This was her moment. And when Tyler showed up, the game would change. Tyler Carter wasn't the kind of person who made waves in a typical way. In fact, growing up, he was the quiet type, always more interested in playing with technology than engaging in the usual teenage pastimes. While other kids played video games, Tyler was busy writing his first lines of code. It was something that came naturally to him. He had a gift for seeing the world through a different lens, a gift that Monique had always encouraged, even when it seemed like no one else understood. It all started when he was about 8 years old. Monique had bought him his first tablet as a birthday gift. Something simple, a device that would allow him to play games and watch videos, just like all the other kids. But Tyler had other plans. Instead of using it for entertainment, he spent every free moment he could figuring out how the tablet worked. He would take it apart, examine the pieces, and then try to put it back together. When he couldn't quite manage that, he went online to watch videos about software development and design. By the time he was 12, Tyler was already developing basic apps. Some were simple, like a calculator app or a notepad, but the creativity was there. He could solve problems with software that really set him apart. At 12, Tyler had built an app that tracked household chores, a project that started as a way to get his younger brother Marcus to help out more around the house. His app worked, and it worked well enough to get noticed when he presented it at a local coding competition. But it wasn't just the apps that impressed people. It was Tyler's way of thinking, his ability to look at the world and see a better, more efficient way to do things. And while he didn't speak much, when he did, people listened. They could see the potential in him, even if he didn't always see it in himself. Monique watched all of this unfold with quiet pride. She knew that Tyler was destined for great things, but she also knew that his success would never come easy. It wasn't just about being talented. Tyler would have to work harder than anyone else, simply because of who he was. People would always doubt him. People would always assume that someone like him, a quiet black kid from a working-class neighborhood, didn't belong in the spaces where innovation and success were celebrated. But Monique had spent years pushing back against those assumptions, and she made sure Tyler would do the same. She reminded him time and again that the world didn't get to decide his worth. It was up to him to define himself, just as she had done when she was his age. By the time Tyler turned 16, he had already earned a reputation as a prodigy in the tech world. He developed several successful apps, some of which gained traction on the App Store and became viral hits. However, one particular idea caught the attention of Silicon Valley investors: a mobile platform designed to simplify data sharing between users in real time. It was a revolutionary concept, one that could change the way people interacted with technology on a daily basis. Monique was there every step of the way as Tyler pitched his startup to investors. She was the silent force behind him, offering advice, encouragement, and support, but never overshadowing his brilliance. When Tyler was nervous about presenting, she reminded him that his work spoke for itself. She knew this was his moment, and it was her job to let him shine. On the day of his first major pitch meeting, Tyler walked into the room with the confidence of someone who had been through countless trials and tribulations, even if he was only 16. He was met by a group of venture capitalists who at first glance weren't sure what to make of him. The tech world wasn't exactly known for being welcoming to young black entrepreneurs, but Tyler had something to prove, and he wasn't going to let their skepticism hold him back. Mr. Carter, one of the investors, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, said with a bemused smile, "It's not often we get a pitch from someone your age. Tell us, what makes you think you can revolutionize the way we share data?" Tyler didn't flinch. Instead, he launched into his pitch, explaining how his platform worked, how it solved significant problems with speed and security, and how it could be integrated into the current tech landscape. He didn't just speak with knowledge, he spoke with passion, and as the investors listened, it became clear that Tyler wasn't just a kid with an idea, he was a visionary. The investors had their doubts, but Tyler's idea was too good to ignore. The meeting ended with them offering a deal on the spot. It wasn't long before Tyler's startup became one of the most talked about companies in Silicon Valley, attracting millions of dollars in funding and turning Tyler into an overnight sensation. Monique, always the proud mother, stayed out of the spotlight. She knew that Tyler's success would eventually speak for itself, but even as his name spread across the headlines, Monique made sure he remained grounded. She reminded him to stay humble, to remember where he came from, and to always focus on giving back. She didn't want him to become like the people who had underestimated her in her youth, the ones who had tried to define her by her background instead of her abilities. The tech world had been quick to embrace Tyler, but Monique wasn't fooled. She knew that success in one area didn't guarantee success in every area of life. In fact, it could make things worse. The more Tyler's name grew, the more she saw the way people would try to tear him down. She saw how some would make assumptions about him because of his age, his race, and the fact that he had grown up in a modest neighborhood. It didn't matter that he had an innovative mind and a solid work ethic. It didn't matter that he was the youngest person ever to receive a major tech award. To some people, he would always be a black kid with a tech company, a kid who didn't belong at the table. Monique had spent her entire life fighting against that kind of thinking, and she wasn't about to let it affect Tyler. She'd worked too hard to get him to where he was, and she would fight just as hard to protect him. Tyler wasn't just her son. He was a symbol of everything she had fought for. He represented the future that people like them were supposed to be excluded from. And now, as he prepared to step into the dealership with her, Monique knew that he had already proved everything he needed to prove. But this was about more than cars. This was about respect. And Richard's disrespectful behavior earlier that day was the perfect reminder of why they needed to show the world who they were. The tension in the dealership was thick, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Monique could feel it the moment Richard stepped into the lounge. He was still wearing that patronizing smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. There was a nervous energy in his posture, like a predator who suddenly realized it wasn't the only one in the room with power. He was trying and failing to mask it. Monique stood up from her seat as the door opened. Her heart skipped a beat, not from fear, but from the anticipation of what was about to happen. She knew Tyler would be here any second, and Richard didn't even know what he was in for. Richard walked towards her with a confident stride, but there was something a little too rehearsed about his movements. He glanced at her briefly, then immediately shifted his gaze towards the corner of the room as though he were looking for an escape route. But there was nowhere to go. Not now. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice smooth, but the hint of a forced smile made it clear he was trying to reassert control over the situation. "It's good to see you again. I'm sorry about the mix-up earlier. I didn't realize you were serious about the purchase." Monique's eyes narrowed slightly. She tilted her head just a fraction, her gaze locking with his. There was no reason for him to apologize now, not after his behavior had already been so clearly dismissive. He wasn't sorry for anything other than the fact that he'd made a fool of himself in front of someone he didn't think could afford his attention. "You didn't realize?" Monique's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made Richard stiffen. "I'm not sure I understand how that's possible. I'm not some charity case who stumbled in off the street. If I wanted to buy a car from you, I would. That's what I'm here for." Richard swallowed. His smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. Of course, he said, as if he could easily dismiss the tension in the room. "I just wanted to make sure we're on the same page. It's not often we get such a distinguished client like yourself. And I—" Before he could finish, the sound of the front door opening interrupted him. Tyler stepped into the room, his presence immediately filling the space. There was no grand entrance. He wasn't that kind of person. But the moment he walked through the door, the energy shifted. Richard froze. He couldn't believe who had just stepped in. There was nobody who lived in the city who didn't know of the young tech millionaire, Tyler. Richard broke out in a sweat as he thought of the colossal mistake he had just made. Tyler, dressed in a sharp black suit, walked with purpose, his head held high, his expression unreadable. He was every bit the prodigy that the world had come to recognize in him. And at that moment, it became clear to Richard that Monique was not just some wealthy client with money to burn. She was a force to be reckoned with. And her son? Well, her son was the future. "Tyler," Monique greeted him with a smile, her voice warm but authoritative. "Come on over. Richard here was just telling me how excited he is to help us today." Tyler didn't look at Richard immediately. Instead, he gave Monique a slight nod and walked towards her. Richard could feel the shift in power. This wasn't just a mother and her son. They were a unit, a team. At that moment, it felt like everyone in the room, including Richard, was being reminded of something they had forgotten. Power didn't always come from a suit and tie. Sometimes it came from the person who didn't need to say anything at all. Tyler stood beside Monique and offered Richard a polite, though distant, smile. Richard cleared his throat and took a step forward, trying to regain control of the situation, though his voice lacked the same authority it had earlier. "Ah, Mr. Carter, it's a pleasure to meet you," he said, his tone a little too formal. "I was just explaining to your mother the various options we have available for her new car. I'm sure you're excited to be part of this process. What car were you two considering?" Tyler raised an eyebrow. "Considering," he repeated, his voice smooth, though there was a hint of a challenge in it. "I thought we were here to make a purchase." Richard's smile faltered for a split second before he recovered. Of course, he stammered. "My mistake. Well, we have several options, Mr. Carter. We've got the latest models of the luxury sedans and SUVs. I'm sure you'll find something that suits your needs." The change in tone didn't fool Tyler. He could already tell that Richard was scrambling to regain his footing, and that made him all the more determined not to let the man off the hook. He looked at Richard with the same steely gaze that had made investors stop questioning him and start signing checks. "I think we're past the point of suits our needs," Tyler said, his voice unwavering. "My mother's been more than clear about what she wants. And it's not just about getting a car. It's about the experience. It's about respect. So, let's not waste anyone's time. What do you have that's going to make that happen?" Richard blinked. He had been prepared for someone like Monique, someone who knew the value of luxury, who understood the weight of a big purchase. But he hadn't expected her son to be so direct. He hadn't expected the air in the room to feel so charged, so full of authority. Monique watched Richard carefully, noting the subtle shift in his demeanor. The tables had turned. No longer was she the one being judged based on her appearance. Monique could see the doubt creeping into Richard's mind. He wasn't just dealing with a wealthy client anymore. He was dealing with the son of someone who had already shown the world that wealth and success didn't look like what people expected them to look like. Tyler's gaze never moved from Richard as he waited for a response. There was a moment of silence, stretching long enough for Richard to feel its weight. And then, finally, he spoke, his voice tight. "Right," Richard said, forcing a smile. "I believe we have just the thing. Please, follow me." Monique and Tyler exchanged a glance, and without saying a word, they followed him toward the showroom floor. But as they walked, the power dynamic in the room had already shifted. Tyler had already made his point. They didn't just belong here. They owned this space. And Richard, for all his polished words and rehearsed gestures, knew it. The showroom floor was sleek and polished, a pristine expanse that exuded wealth and exclusivity. Rows of luxury cars gleamed under the bright lights, each model more impressive than the last. But as Monique and Tyler followed him into the heart of the dealership, the glittering vehicles felt almost like props, empty symbols of status meant to be flaunted in front of the right audience. Richard led them to a section at the back of the showroom, where the most expensive models were displayed. The cars here were masterpieces designed for those who didn't just want to be seen. But Monique wasn't interested in statements. She didn't care for the flash of wealth, the kind that shouted louder than substance. She was here for one thing: respect. Richard seemed to have forgotten that. He moved with exaggerated gestures, clearly trying to impress them as he showed off the various models. But Monique wasn't impressed. She was watching him, watching how he moved, how his words came so easily. "Now, this is what I believe would suit your needs perfectly," Richard said, stepping in front of a sleek black sports sedan with a shiny chrome finish. "The latest model is one of the most exclusive on the market right now. Very few people can even get their hands on one of these. Definitely a symbol of success." He was laying it on thick, almost as if trying to convince himself. The last words, "a symbol of success," rang hollow in the air. Monique raised an eyebrow and glanced at Tyler. He looked calm, unfazed, like he had already decided this was a waste of time. "I see," Monique replied, her voice betraying none of her internal frustration. "And what makes this one so special?" Richard's expression tightened, just for a moment. He hadn't expected the question. His smile remained, but it wasn't as easy as before. He cleared his throat, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Well, it's the cutting-edge design, the bespoke interior, the state-of-the-art technology. You'll never find anything else like it on the road. It's a perfect choice for someone who knows what they want." Tyler stepped forward, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp as he scanned the car. He was picking up on the salesman's desperation, the way he was trying to sell a lifestyle rather than a car. It was the same way people in the tech world sometimes tried to sell him an image, to make him feel like he needed to fit into a mold. It was the same problem, just dressed in a different suit. "Yeah, I can tell," Tyler said coolly, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "It's definitely a car that makes a statement. Too bad we're not here to make a statement." Richard's eyes widened for a second before he masked it with a forced laugh. "Of course not, Mr. Carter. Of course not," he stammered. "But surely someone of your standing would appreciate the finer details. Wouldn't you agree? The craftsmanship, the exclusivity." Monique's patience was thinning, but she didn't let it show. She stepped forward, positioning herself next to Tyler as she addressed Richard, who now seemed to be spiraling in front of them. "We don't need your exclusivity, Richard," she said, her tone sharp, cutting through the superficial charm he was trying to sell. "We need honesty. We need a car that works, a car that doesn't just look the part, but actually performs. It's not about showing off. It's about quality." Tyler gave his mother a slight, approving nod, then turned to face Richard fully. "We've been through this already. My mom knows what she wants, and she doesn't need you to pitch her on symbolism or status. We're not here to buy into an image, we're here to buy a car. So, let's cut the crap and talk about what really matters." There was a moment of silence. Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. He wasn't prepared for this kind of confrontation. He had assumed that Monique's wealth and reputation would make her an easy target for his sales tactics. He had underestimated her. He had underestimated Tyler. "Let's get one thing straight, Richard," Monique continued, her voice low, but filled with authority. "You don't get to assume anything about us. Not based on the color of my skin. Not based on my son's age. Not based on how we choose to spend our money. So far, you've shown me nothing but attitude. If you can't handle that, maybe it's time we took our business elsewhere." Richard blinked rapidly, his cheeks flushing as he desperately tried to salvage the situation. He knew he had messed up, but the last thing he wanted to do was admit it. His hands trembled slightly as he ran them through his hair, and, for the first time, he felt the weight of his arrogance. Of course. I'm sorry," he stammered, his voice lacking the conviction it had earlier. "I'm just trying to ensure you're getting the best experience, that's all. Let's move on. There are other models I can show you, something more in line with your needs, I'm sure." Tyler and Monique exchanged a glance. Monique could tell that Tyler was done playing Richard's game, and she was too. They weren't here to appease this man. They were here to remind him who had the power. "Lead the way," Tyler said, his voice firm, his words leaving no room for argument. Richard nodded quickly and began walking toward another section of the showroom, his shoulders hunched. But as Richard walked away, a slight shift occurred. Monique could see it in his posture and the way he was trying so hard to maintain his professionalism. He was no longer in control of the situation. Tyler had taken that from him without even trying. As they followed Richard through the showroom, Monique realized that this moment wasn't just about choosing a car. It was about something much bigger, a reminder that no matter how much people tried to box them in, no matter how many times they'd been underestimated, they would always be in charge of their own story. Richard led them down the showroom floor, passing more cars as if he were in a trance, his eyes darting from one vehicle to the next, searching for something, anything, that might salvage his earlier blunder. Monique and Tyler followed, but there was no mistaking the change in their demeanor. They weren't just walking. This was a statement of power, of ownership, of control. Richard stopped at a corner where a sleek silver sports car rested, its chrome accents reflecting the bright overhead lights. "This one," he said with a forced enthusiasm, "is our flagship model. It is a limited edition, and just a handful of it is produced worldwide. The performance is unmatched, and the interior is absolutely state-of-the-art. I'm sure someone of your stature would appreciate the attention to detail." Monique studied the car with a disinterested gaze. She could see it, but the flashy exterior and designer badges didn't fool her. There were too many people out there who thought a shiny exterior could mask the lack of substance underneath. Richard wasn't fooling her with his words or his gestures. Tyler, on the other hand, stepped closer to the car, inspecting it from every angle. He didn't touch. It didn't seem all that impressed, but his sharp eyes caught every detail. His gaze flicked back to Richard, who was now standing beside the car, looking at them expectantly. Tyler's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles before he turned to Monique. "Well, Mom," Tyler said, his tone casual but with a weight that made it clear he wasn't just talking about the car. "It looks shiny enough, doesn't it?" Monique raised an eyebrow. "Shiny doesn't mean anything to me, Tyler." Tyler nodded. "Exactly. It's like Richard here. He's shiny on the outside, but I'm not sure what's on the inside." His words were light. They carried an edge that made Richard's smile falter. Richard stiffened, but he didn't dare respond. He had already dug his own grave, and no amount of car salesmanship was going to cover it now. He forced a laugh, trying to deflect the tension that hung in the air. "Well, I assure you, this model is more than just shiny. It's about performance, about prestige." Monique's voice was unwavering. "I don't care about prestige. I care about the ride. What makes this car different from the others, Richard?" Richard hesitated, his eyes flicking to the car, then to Monique, and finally to Tyler. The words he had rehearsed in his head felt weak now, slipping through his fingers like sand. It's the engine," he said, trying to latch onto something. "A custom-built engine, high horsepower, lightning-fast acceleration. No other car in the world has it." Tyler's expression remained impassive, but his eyes gleamed with the same intensity they always had when he was analyzing something. "I'm not sure I believe you, Richard," he said simply. "You've been talking about this car like it's the holy grail. But what I'm hearing is more like a sales pitch than an actual explanation." Monique glanced at Tyler, her pride in him evident, and then turned back to Richard. "You see, Richard, my son has a talent for spotting BS. And right now, that's all you're selling." Richard's face flushed, his pulse quickening as the weight of her words hit him. He had made the mistake of underestimating not just Monique, but Tyler as well. What he hadn't realized was that Tyler wasn't just Monique's son. He was her equal. And, in many ways, he was the one who truly held the power. Not just because of his wealth or status, but because of his mind, his presence, and the way he could dismantle someone like Richard with nothing but a few well-placed words. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He was done. Every word he'd tried to use to manipulate and control this situation had failed. Monique turned to Tyler, her tone softening. "You know what, sweetheart? Let's skip the rest of this. We came here for a reason, and we don't need to play Richard's game." Tyler nodded in agreement. "Exactly. We're done here." He turned to Richard, his gaze cold, dismissive. "You've wasted enough of our time." Richard's lips parted in shock, but he couldn't find anything to say that would change the course of the conversation. He had nothing left to offer. I'm sorry," Richard stammered, his voice barely a whisper now. I don't know what came over me." Monique gave him one last glance, her expression unreadable, before turning to leave. "Next time, Richard, don't judge a book by its cover. You might just find that the ones you're looking down on are the ones who own the shelf." Tyler flashed a knowing smile. "And don't forget," he added, "it's not the car that makes the man. It's the man who makes the car." Without another word, they walked out of the showroom, leaving Richard standing in the midst of his failed sales pitch. The once confident salesman was left with nothing but the echo of his own mistakes and the cold realization that he had just been schooled by a mother and son who knew precisely what they wanted and knew how to get it. As they stepped outside, the air of the early afternoon hit them, refreshing and clean. Monique glanced at Tyler, a proud smile tugging at her lips. "Good job in there, baby," she said, her voice warm but laced with an undertone of satisfaction. "You really showed him what it means to underestimate us." Tyler shrugged, his grin widening. "I just said what needed to be said. He'll learn. He has to." "Yeah," Monique agreed, taking a deep breath. "The world could use a few more people like you, Tyler. People who don't need to fit into the mold, who know their worth without anyone having to tell them. You don't just buy into a brand. You make your own." Tyler's eyes softened as he looked at her. "We both do, Mom." Together, they walked toward the car that would take them back home, the weight of the dealership behind them. Monique and Tyler's encounter at the dealership had been more than just a small victory. In a world where perception often equaled power, where people's assumptions were based on wealth, race, and outward appearances, they had flipped the script. By the time they were driving away from the dealership, the effects of their actions were already starting to ripple through the luxury car world. What they didn't know yet was how far those ripples would go. Back at the dealership, Richard stood frozen in place, his mind racing. He could still hear Monique's words echoing in his ears, her sharp and biting commentary about judgment, assumptions, and the games he'd tried to play. How had he not seen it before? How had he allowed his own biases to get in the way of what could have been a lucrative sale? His thoughts swirled with embarrassment, frustration, and most of all, shame. He'd failed, and it wasn't just a small mistake. It was a monumental error that would cost him far more than a single sale. But the ripple effect wasn't confined to Richard. Word began to spread throughout the dealership. The salespeople, who had been watching from the sidelines, whispered about the incident as soon as Monique and Tyler had left. What had started as a casual encounter in a posh showroom quickly morphed into a story that everyone was talking about. A few days later, one of the managers from the dealership, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa, called Richard into her office. She was in her mid-30s, with a no-nonsense attitude that matched her crisp business attire. She leaned back in her chair, her arms folded, giving Richard a long, appraising look. "Richard," she began, her voice calm but with a hint of edge, "I've heard about what happened the other day. The sale with the two clients, Monique and her son. She raised an eyebrow, watching his reaction closely. Richard swallowed hard, feeling his throat go dry. He knew what was coming. Lisa was one of those managers who didn't mince words. "I have to say, Richard," Lisa continued, "I'm surprised. I thought you knew better. You've been here long enough to know that we don't make assumptions based on race, age, or any of the other nonsense you let get in the way of that sale." Richard opened his mouth to protest, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he explain himself? He had let his arrogance and presumptions take over, and now there was no excuse. I just didn't think—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. It sounded weak, even to him. Lisa's gaze hardened. "Well, think again. Monique's a regular here. She's a high-net-worth client. But more than that, she's the kind of person we should be attracting, not pushing away. Her son, Tyler, he's one to watch. We all need to learn from this." She leaned forward, her tone turning sharp. "We can't afford to make assumptions like that again, Richard. Not about anyone. You've been here for years, but this was a rookie mistake." Richard nodded silently, his face flushed with embarrassment. He had let his biases color his judgment, and now it was clear that he had jeopardized not just the sale, but his reputation as well. He had no defense, no excuses. "I understand," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Lisa exhaled sharply, clearly frustrated, but unwilling to give up on him just yet. "You're lucky Monique and Tyler didn't walk out of here and tell the whole world about what happened. You don't want to burn bridges with someone like them. Trust me." She paused, her eyes locking onto his. "Get your act together, and don't let it happen again." Richard swallowed, nodded, and left her office. He knew that this was far from over, and the sting of his failure was far from gone. Meanwhile, outside the dealership, Monique and Tyler were continuing their journey. They had put the dealership, and Richard, behind them, but the effects of their actions would follow them in ways they hadn't anticipated. While the ripple effect was already spreading within the dealership, it would soon stretch far beyond. Monique was calm in the passenger seat, but Tyler could see the slight tension in her posture. She had accomplished what she'd set out to do, but there was a sense that this was just the beginning. The kind of confrontation they had orchestrated was bound to attract attention, and Monique knew that attention would not always be kind. "You know, Mom," Tyler said after a moment of silence, "I think Richard will probably lose his job after this. That kind of mistake isn't easy to recover from, especially with someone like Lisa overseeing things." Monique glanced at him and gave a small, wry smile. "I don't feel bad for him. He needs to learn. People like him get comfortable with their biases, assuming they can control the narrative. But people like us, we're not just part of the story. They're going to have to rewrite it. I won't apologize for making him face that reality." Tyler nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "You're right. People like Richard think they can judge us based on the color of our skin or the way we look, but they don't know the half of it. They never do." Monique's lips quirked into a smile. "No, they don't, and they probably never will." The conversation faded into a comfortable silence as they drove. Still, both of them knew that the encounter at the dealership wasn't just a personal victory. It was part of something larger. It was a message to the world, one that would reverberate through their circles and beyond. They had proven that their worth wasn't defined by anyone's expectations, not by their race, their wealth, or their appearance. The ripple effect from Monique and Tyler's visit to the dealership didn't just stop at Richard's office or even on the showroom floor. It spread far and wide and began to shift perceptions in ways no one had anticipated. The luxury car world, so often a bastion of old money, exclusivity, and long-held biases, was beginning to see the cracks in its pristine image. And Monique, quietly but undeniably, was the catalyst for it all. A week after their encounter at the dealership, Monique received a call. It was Lisa, the manager, who had lectured Richard about his behavior. But this time, the tone was different. Apologetic, even respectful. "Miss Carter, I want to thank you for your patience," Lisa began, her voice warmer than it had been during their previous conversation. "I've spoken with my team, and I've reviewed the situation. You were absolutely right in everything you said. Richard's behavior wasn't just a mistake, it was an oversight of the way we should be treating clients. It's a new world, and it's time we all start seeing it that way." Monique could hear the sincerity in Lisa's voice. There was no hesitation, no defensiveness, only a genuine desire to make things right. "I appreciate that," Monique responded, her voice steady. "But it's not just about this incident. It's about a broader shift, one that goes beyond your dealership. If people like Richard and his colleagues don't understand the new dynamics, well, they'll be left behind." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You're right," Lisa said after a moment, "and I think it's time to do more than just apologize. We want to show you that we've learned from this and that we're evolving. If you're open to it, I'd like to invite you and your son back for a special event we're hosting. It's not just about showcasing cars. It's about showcasing a new mindset, one that includes people like you and Tyler. We want to celebrate diversity, inclusion, and the future of luxury. What do you think?" Monique didn't hesitate. "Sounds like a step in the right direction," she replied. "But let me make one thing clear. This isn't just a show. It's a commitment. If you want to change, it's about more than words. It's about action." "I understand," Lisa said quickly. "And that's exactly what we want. Real change." A few days later, Monique and Tyler returned to the dealership. This time, it was different. The event was well attended, but it wasn't just about the cars on display. The focus was on conversations, dialogue, and genuine connection. Monique and Tyler were at the center of it all, talking to influential figures in the automotive industry, business leaders, and clients from all walks of life. The message was clear. The times were changing, and those who didn't adapt would be left behind. Richard, standing off to the side, watched in disbelief. He had thought that the moment Monique and Tyler walked out of the showroom, it was over, that they would vanish into the ether like so many other clients he had written off. But here they were, standing at the forefront of this new era, proving everyone wrong. Lisa had pulled him aside earlier in the day. She had even threatened his job as she told him about the importance of not only being inclusive, but also genuinely respecting those who were different from him. She had made it clear that his actions were being watched, not just by the dealership, but by a larger audience. He had been given a second chance, but only because the dealership knew they needed to change, and change fast. Richard stood there now, trying to blend into the crowd, feeling out of place. It was clear that he had underestimated Monique and Tyler. But it wasn't just about the sale he had lost. It was about everything he hadn't been willing to see before. "You know," Tyler said, stepping up beside Monique as they surveyed the event, "I didn't expect it to go this far. It's kind of incredible." Monique gave him a knowing smile. "The ripple effect, baby. One small action can change everything. And sometimes, people need to be shaken out of their comfort zones to realize it." Tyler nodded. "I think Richard's finally starting to get it. But it's going to take more than an event like this to change people like him. They'll have to do the work." Monique's gaze turned thoughtful. "And it's not our job to make them see. We just keep pushing forward. We make our own rules, create our own space, and anyone who wants to join us, well, they'll have to step up." As the evening progressed, Monique and Tyler's influence was undeniable. They weren't just guests. They were leaders in a conversation that was transforming the world around them. The event became a watershed moment, and soon, other dealerships across the country began to take notice. The automotive world has always been defined by a narrow image of wealth and exclusivity, but it was starting to widen its scope, embracing the diversity that had always existed but had often been ignored. By the end of the evening, Richard approached Monique. This time, there was no arrogance in his step, only a quiet humility, an acknowledgement of his earlier mistakes. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice softer than before, "I just want to say, I've learned a lot from you and Tyler, and I apologize for what happened. I hope this event shows that we are committed to doing better." Monique met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "I appreciate that, Richard. But remember, it's not just about showing up. It's about the change that happens every day. And you have a choice: adapt or be left behind." Richard nodded, finally understanding the weight of her words. He had thought that the world of luxury cars was about shiny exteriors and big names. But Monique had shown him that true luxury wasn't about what you drove. It was about who you were and how you treated others. As the evening came to a close, Monique and Tyler left the dealership, the evening's success echoing in their minds. They had accomplished what they set out to do, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been judged by the color of their skin, their background, or their financial status. They didn't need to be accepted into this world. They had created their own. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing. I put a lot of time into crafting these heartfelt narratives, and your support means the world. Thank you for being part of this journey.